Fine, ma'am. I'll first introduce you, ma'am, and then you'll have your time for the talk.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Okay, I welcome Tamara Sears, ma'am, for being with us here. Dr. Tamara Sears is an associate professor of art history at Rutgers University. Her research focuses on the art and architectural history of South Asia, with a particular focus on the Indian subcontinent. Her first book, Worldly Gurus and the Spiritual Kings, Architecture and Aestheticism in Medieval India, received the Prose Award in Architecture and Urban Planning for Excellence in Professional and Scholarly Publishing by the American Association of Publishers. She is currently completing her second book that examines the relationships among architecture, environmental history, and travel on local, regional, and global scales. Dr. Sears has also co-edited with Nachiket Chanchani, Mobility, Mercantile Communities, and the Transmission of Architectural Knowledge in Medieval India. Her essays have appeared in over a dozen volumes and journals, including the Art Bulletin, Ars Orientalis, and Archives of the Asian Art. These include Ibn Battuta's Buddhists, Monuments Memory, and the Materiality of Travel in Encountering Buddhism and Islam in Pre-Modern Central and South Asia, edited by Blaine Orr and Igno Strauch. The Shape of Barber's Lake, Architecture and Water in the Central Indian Frontier in Water Histories of South Asia. The Materiality of Liquescence, edited by Venugopal Madipati and Sugata Ray. Her research has been supported by grants and fellowships from Fulbright, the J. Paul Getty Foundation, the National Humanities Center, Dumbarton Oaks, and the Clark Art Institute. Dr. Sears will be speaking today on Surveying Narco Routes, the Entangled Histories of Opium and Archaeology in Colonial Central India. We welcome you, ma'am, and please continue with the talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes,
perfect. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share my screen. Can you see this okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, good. All right. So all right, now I'm on. So I want to begin by thanking Parul Pandidar and her colleagues and students at Delhi for giving me the opportunity to present as part of this series. Before jumping into the main topic of my talk, what I'd like to do is take a few minutes to talk about the larger project of which this is a part, and to give you a sense for where what I'm going to present fits in and what it adds to the whole. So the paper that I'm presenting today comes out of a chapter towards the end of this larger book project, the second book project that I'm trying to complete, which is entitled Wilderness Urbanisms. And this is a project that focuses on the relationship between architecture, landscape, and travel in central India, in areas currently subsumed by the present-day state of Madhya Pradesh. The book is a longue durée project that brings together architecture, material culture, and landscape as archives for mapping mobility and long-distance transmissions of knowledge. So the project itself follows the development of temple towns and villages in crucial areas of central India that extended broadly between the two historic cities of Gwalior and Vidisha, and more specifically in the area that stretching between the medieval fortresses at Narwar and Chanderi. And most of the book, in fact, is rooted in the period between around 650 and 1200 or so, or 1300. When I first began tracing these settlements through my fieldwork, I found, and this was many years ago, I found that they largely followed the course of local and regional rivers. On a regional level, what we were looking at are the Betwa and the Sindh rivers, both of which are part of the larger Yamuna basin. And on a more localized level, what I've been looking at more specifically are the Madhumati and Ahiravati rivers, known today as the Mahuar and the Or. And these are both tributaries, small tributaries of the Sindh River. But as you can see from this map, they are small tributaries that gave rise to a large number of settlements and temple towns. So in medieval India, this area was largely part of a geography that was understood as the wilderness, the Aranya, this dangerous terrain overseen by local chiefs with shifting political allegiances and populated by bandits and wild animals. And we get this from inscriptions, from travel reports, and so forth. It was kind of on the borders between Bundelkhand and Malwa. But it was also a geography that was frequently traversed. It constituted a crucial north-south vertical corridor, which connected the imperial centers of northern India with the Deccan to the south and the coastal ports to the west. Both the rivers and the sites that served as the focus for my fieldwork played a significant role in fostering a network of routes that are described in many sources. So we have travelers, including people like the Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta, who passed through a number of these places while making his way from Delhi to Cambay in the 1340s. So in addition to facilitating the movement of merchants and also pilgrims over centuries, these routes also saw the passage of armies during the course of military campaigns. They were trodden, for example, by the warring forces of the main imperial dynasties of North and South India in the early medieval period, the Rashtrakutas and Gujara Pratiharas, and we can find traces of those battles still through hero stones recording the death of warriors in battles associated with those larger conflicts. And I'm showing one example here that's now in the Gwalior Archaeological Museum, recording the death of a local individual while fighting the Karnatas or the Rashtrakutas in what is essentially 905 CE. And there are also sites of crucial battles between the Chandelas to the east, the Bundelkhand, and the later rulers of central India in the 12th and 13th centuries, as evidenced through this rubbing of an inscription on a memorial pillar recording a battle in the village of Bangla on the outskirts of Narwar Fort on Friday, March 28, 1281. At the time, Narwar Fort had come under the control of a short-lived but important dynasty, the Yajvapalas, and the Chandelas were made an unsuccessful attempt to seize it in a period that is usually in larger histories associated with sultanate conflicts rather than inter-regional conflicts such as this. But this was hotly contested by many different parties. After the 14th century, the region was the site of repeated campaigns by the armies, first of the Delhi Sultans and later the Mughals, who were constantly marching to variously regain or retain their control over regions further south. So simply put, the fortresses of Gwalior to the far north is the main political center, but also Narwar and Chanderi formed a golden trifecta for any ruler with aspirations of moving onward through Malwa and into the Deccan in order to expand the range of their imperial control. So if you wanted to launch a campaign against the Deccan, for example, you had to control these three fortresses. If you wanted to get into Malwa, these were the three major places to control. So the remoteness of this region made it a haven for bandits and rebel forces resisting imperial control during different periods. So without these three fortresses, the tracts of wilderness that extended across central India and the routes that ran through them would have been impossible to regulate or police. And so by way of illustration, I give you here a detail on the bottom right from a folio from the Baburnama, or the emperors of the Mughal emperor, the memoirs of the Mughal emperor Babur, which illustrates his successful conquest of the fortress of Chanderi in January of 1528 during the first campaign that he launched after conquering Delhi. And this was crucial for those of you who are familiar with the Baburnama and with the sequence of events in defeating allies of his key Rajput rivals and extending his control into Malwa. So most of my fieldwork consisted of documenting material in situ, mostly from earlier periods, in mapping the distribution of temples, tanks, and other monuments and material culture to get a sense for the chronology of building and the expansion of settlements. However, I also spent time going through archaeological reports and looking for colonial era documentation of sites to supplement my fieldwork. This was a bit of a challenge because the regions between Narwar and Chanderi were not centrally administered by the British, but rather by the princely state of Gwalior, which had come under, as most of you know, under the rule of the Scindia family in the 18th century as the power of the Mughals receded. So the British archaeological documentation from the 19th century was spottier than from other regions that were more directly under colonial control, at least until Alexander Cunningham began his surveys in the 1860s and 70s and made several tours to the region. So this is really an archival issue more than anything else. However, in my exploration of colonial era archaeological sources, there was one notable exception. While going through the records at the British Library one summer, this is a long time ago, well over a decade and a half ago, when I first started working in this area, I came across a series of drawings by a British officer, Lieutenant Frederick Charles Macy, who for a brief period in the 1840s and early 1850s was posted to central India to conduct preliminary archaeological explorations. At the time, I could not determine for the life of me why he had traveled to these places and produced a handful of detailed images. It seemed to be disconnected from the larger explorations that were happening further east. And I should also note that Macy is not really a major figure in the history of archaeology, but he's not entirely unknown. But it just seemed to be a very strange, it seemed to me to be very strange at the time that he would have been, you know, at these particularly remote places. And in fact, actually, what he is known for is his connection with Alexander Cunningham. And so he's not so much known for his own explorations than with his association with the venerable Alexander Cunningham, who later became the first director general of the Archaeological Survey upon its foundation in 1861. And more specifically, he acted as Cunningham's assistant in the excavation of the famous Buddhist monuments at Sanchi, the findings of which were circulated widely through the publication of the Bilsatopes in 1854. So the excavations were in 1851 and the Bilsatopes in 1854. So Macy assisted not only in the excavation, but also in the production of dozens of drawings that provided the foundation for 33 plates containing many, that accompanied this publication. And here you see on the right, a watercolor now at the British Library showing a general view of the monuments set within their landscape. So while I found this interesting at the time, Sanchi was really not the main focus of my research, and Macy's other drawings were ultimately not that useful in helping me decipher earlier histories of the places that were my main sites. But I could not help but continue to wonder why he had been deployed to this remote corner of central India at this particular moment, since it seemed, again, like a fairly strange and random choice. But although this question was beyond the scope of what I was doing with this earlier material, I remained curious, and so I filed it away in the back of my head until I started looking into the colonial history of the era for what I thought was going to be a brief concluding coda to my book. And then I came across writings by economic historians such as Amar Farooqi on opium and narco-trafficking in Gwalior state. And I realized that Macy's deployment to central India came suspiciously at the heels of other developments, not the least of which were connected to the growing British interest in controlling the traffic of Malwa opium, which required also being able to regulate the armies and the territories associated with the princely state of Gwalior. So as it stands now, the travels and drawings of Frederick Charles Macy has become a kind of framing narrative around what will be a full-length chapter that explores the continuing iterations and legacies of the sites, mobilities, and environmental histories that I lay out earlier in the earlier centuries in the bulk of this project. And as I will go into further detail later, what this body of economic history made me realize was that Macy's foray into central India very more specifically came at the heels of the first Opium War, at a moment when it became important for the British to control the routes of travel leading through central India, And these were indeed the very same routes extending across the same tracts of remote wilderness areas that had been, contested between Bundelkhand and Malwa for centuries, that earlier regional and imperial rulers had sought to control in earlier periods, but for different reasons. So my caveat here is I'm not a historian of colonial India, and my intention is not so much to disentangle the politics or economics of opium production and trafficking. Rather, I want to draw from that body of material in order to reevaluate a different history, that of archaeological exploration, particularly as it pertains to this particular region of central India. And as most people in this audience probably know, the various lenses that were brought to bear on Indian monuments and landscapes by colonial era surveyors, archaeologists, and artists has long been of great interest to scholars who've worked through the many ways in which British images reinforced imperial aspirations by projecting an idea of India as both pre-modern and also profitable. We know that the practices of colonial representation were closely linked not only to the rise of antiquarianism, but also to military operations, to the need to survey contested terrain and map out the present and future extents of colonial administrative control. What I'm interested in today's paper is connected more broadly to the goals of the book, to better understand the ways in which visual and material culture were connected to mobility, landscapes, and routes of travel. So it's a slightly different kind of objective. I'm not going to be disentangling the politics of the picturesque. I'm much more interested in what this body of material tells us about the investments and the close relationship between surveying and surveillance. So I should note that what I am presenting today is very much a work in progress, and it's the first time that I'm presenting at such length on this material. So I gave a shorter preliminary talk in a private workshop earlier this winter, but this is my first effort to really flesh out some of this material, and so I welcome your comments and thoughts. So my talk from here on has three parts. The first, I'm going to situate Frederick Charles Macy in relationship to a longer history of surveys, linking him to modes of visual surveillance and the burgeoning colonial investment in archaeological exploration. And I'm also going to look a little bit more specifically at the historical circumstances underlying his arrival in Gwalior State and its relationship to British interests in opium monopolies. In the second, I look more critically at Macy's drawings, at his modes of representation and the subtextual context for his activities in the field. And as an art historian and invested in the geography of this area, the cultural geography of this area, this is my primary investment, both in today's talk and in the larger project. And then finally, I'll conclude briefly by briefly considering the legacies of Macy's work in central India. And my investment there is twofold. I'm interested firstly in how Macy enables us to rethink histories of archaeological practice and related construction of ideas of India's past. And secondly, I'm interested in the relationship to ongoing environmental histories, to the lingering effects of British investments in agricultural production on present-day landscapes in ways that stand in striking contrast to the patterns of settlement that I've traced in the early medieval past. So with that, I'm going to turn to Frederick Charles Macy and his relationship with a longer history of surveying. Okay. So Frederick Charles Macy arrived in India in September of 1842 to begin an appointment with the 67th Regiment of the Bengal Native Infantry. Trained as a military engineer officer at the acclaimed Addiscombe Military Seminary in Surrey, he was particularly well suited for conducting geographic and architectural surveys. To make use of his many talents, his superiors sent him to serve in central India in 1845, where he was tasked with the job of surveying antiquities in some of the most remote areas of the region. He continued to do so in various capacities until 1852, when he was called away to serve as a surveyor in the Second Anglo-Burmese War, which extended into 1853. Although he returned to India in 1854 and continued to serve in the military through numerous promotions, finally becoming a general in 1888, he never returned either to his work surveying antiquities or to central India. Instead, his postings were primarily as a deputy judge advocate into Punjab, Delhi, and finally in Bengal. So this was really his one stint as in archaeological exploration. You see Frederick Charles Macy here in the foreground of one of his sketches. This is probably one of the more famous images circulating in relationship to Macy. So we see him there in the foreground of a sketch that he is making of the remains of a 15th century mosque at the town of Chanderi, which stands at the base of the massive hilltop fortress that had served as a major regional bastion for many centuries, and which is the same fortress that I showed you of the painted image of Babur's conquest a few slides back. So the idea that Macy's deployment to central India may have been connected to the amassing of military intelligence is not entirely surprising, as the projects of surveying and surveilling had frequently gone hand in hand. Knowledge of geography was essential, not only for establishing political boundaries, but also for determining the best strategies for their military defense, particularly when trying to secure newly acquired territories that were both unknown and in a state of political transition. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this particular history, we know that the 18th and 19th century, for example, was a moment of particularly vibrant but also contentious realignment of allegiances. In any case, so mapping was, and it was also the kind of moment where the British were beginning to exert control over areas of India, and so mapping became a very important way of understanding terrain and exerting control over the landscape. So within a decade following the decisive British victory over the Nawab of Bengal at the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the British launched successively large-scale efforts to produce a comprehensive geographic survey of Britain's newly acquired territories. So in 1864, very famously, James Renaud, originally an officer in the Royal Navy, was commissioned as an ensign in the Bengal Engineers and given the task of surveying the Ganges River for the purpose of determining a navigable route from the administrative center in Calcutta to the northern regions of the Indian subcontinent. His duties expanded in the decades that followed. In 1767, he was given the task of surveying the entire territory under the Bengal presidency in conjunction with his appointment as Surveyor General of Bengal. And by the mid-1770s, his duty grew to include broader surveys of land that could be potentially exploited as sources of tax revenue. So mapping, of course, was connected with the termination of routes, with the sort of understanding of territory, and also with sort of these looking for places that could be exploited for revenue. The job of surveying was thereby inevitably placed in the hands of British Army officers, many of whom were very well educated and had been trained as engineers. So most famously, we have Colonel Colin Mackenzie, who had amassed a tremendous collection of drawings while conducting military surveys in South India. And of course, we all know that he was trained as a military engineer and that he oversaw two major surveys associated with British military interests. The first was the survey of the Nizam of Hyderabad's dominions between 1792 and 1798, which, in addition to providing a remarkable record of archaeological materials, also provided crucial information that proved instrumental in ultimately defeating Tipu Sultan in 1799 during the Fourth Mysore War. And you see here a watercolor drawing by Mackenzie of a hilltop fort drawn in 1790 with a, you can see this is while he was marching with his army at the onset of the Third Mysore War. So this is the kind of drawing the landscape went hand in hand with military campaigns. So the second was the Mysore Survey, conducted between 1799 and 1810, which followed shortly upon the defeat of Tipu Sultan's former kingdom. And it's worth noting that the British victory over Mysore did not lead to the direct acquisition of new territories, but the restoration of the throne of the former Gwalior dynasty and establishment of Mysore as a subsidiary princely state, over which the British exerted indirect control. So on the merits of his work, both militarily and in terms of his surveying, Mackenzie was appointed as the first Surveyor General of India in 1815. So Mackenzie was also associated with the initial discovery in 1798 and the subsequent survey and excavation nearly 2 decades later in 1816 and 17 of the famed Buddhist stupa site of Amaravati. 121 of the fragments that he recorded were sent subsequently to England in 1859, and they can currently be seen on display at the British Museum. So it was not only the practice of archaeology in British India, but also the emerging ontology of the Indian art object that was arguably, from its early inception, fundamentally entangled with military affairs. So what makes Macy's deployment different from these is in what it represented in the history of the establishment of institutionalized archaeological work. So the work of surveyors like Mackenzie and also his contemporary Francis Buchanan, who conducted a 7-year-long survey in Bengal from 1807 to 1814, marked a movement towards both systematic surveys and state-supported archaeological research. But it also coincided with an increasing interest in archaeology and antiquarianism, fostered by the pioneering work of Alexander Cunningham and James Ferguson, whose intensive documentation of sites, particularly in the 1830s and the early 1840s, vastly expanded both the corpus of known monuments and their historical geography. As Tapadi Guha Thakurta has effectively argued, what set people like Cunningham and Ferguson aside or apart from the earlier work of surveyors such as Mackenzie was the bringing together of visual and textual records with a dedication to research and historical knowledge. Unlike earlier surveyors, both Cunningham and Ferguson devoted themselves to the task of acquiring specialized expertise that could enable them not only to comprehensively record what they found in the field, but also interpret it. So whereas Ferguson cultivated his knowledge of architectural and sculptural styles and forms, and also his capacity as a draftsman, Cunningham became an expert in ancient scripts and epigraphy. And Cunningham in particular became an advocate for a more systematic investment in surveying the full extent of monuments in India and taking up steps to ensure their preservation. Unsurprisingly, like any commercially motivated colonial enterprise, the East India Company was loath to invest liberally in anything that was guaranteed to reap, that was not guaranteed to reap solid financial returns. So there was a growing kind of push towards investing in archaeological exploration, the preservation of monuments, and the East India Company was initially resistant because they couldn't see how they would profit in return. Nonetheless, as the story goes, the company caved under pressure from the Royal Asiatic Society to take responsibility for the preservation of monuments. And so in 1847, the company outlined a plan for establishing a commission to collect accurate and detailed information about the nature, extent, and state of monuments throughout the subcontinent. The government general at the time, Henry Harding, was disinclined still to commit the resources, suggesting instead that preliminary explorations be undertaken by military officers who possessed, and this is in quotes, habits of research and knowledge of Indian antiquities. So not quite full on the type of archaeological process that envisioned by Ferguson or Cunningham, where the archaeologist was a professional historian and surveyor, but to utilize military officers who Harding could argue or could be arguably possessed habits of research. So it's still this kind of in between. So 2 officers were selected to conduct explorations. The first was Markham Kitto, who was appointed the archaeological inquirer to the government in northwestern provinces, known for his publication of illustrations of Indian monuments, Hindu, Buddhist, and Islamic, and also for his experience conducting archaeological tours in Orissa. He continued his work in Eastern India, carrying out excavations in Bihar and Orissa, as well as at Sarnath near Benares. The second was none other than Frederick Charles Macy, who was given the task of conducting surveys in central India in the regions of Gwalior, Malwa, and Bundelkhand. He was a logical choice, as he had already been engaged in the area for 2 years, since 1845, and he had already spent at least 2 seasons surveying this densely rural terrain. What is notable is that most of this geography, as I noted, unlike the areas that Cateau was traveling, most of this fell beyond the direct control of the British. This was, as I mentioned earlier, it fell under the purview of the princely state of Gwalior, ruled by members of the Scindia family. So the fine details of Gwalior's involvement in the larger conflicts between the British and the Marathas are beyond the scope of today's paper. And we know certainly that they were defeated sort of decisively. The Marathas had been defeated decisively in the third and final Anglo-Maratha War, and that Gwalior had remained generally neutral and mostly an ally rather than an adversary to the British. And it accepted the supremacy of the East India Company relatively easily, in some ways, in 1818. However, the Gwalior Army remained one of the strongest within the princely states of North India, and the East India Company often came up against resistance at efforts at intervention within the territories under the Scindia's control. So it was only really in 1843 to 84, literally shortly a year or two before Macy's first deployment to the area, that the British authority had been firmly established after a major military offensive against the Scindia army. This was an offensive that essentially resulted in the dismantlement of the Gwalior Army in an effort to minimize the potential for future rebellious outbreaks, but also in an attempt to garner more control over the area. So in the place of the Gwalior, Gwalior Army was formed a legion known as the Gwalior Contingent, consisting mostly of native soldiers or sepoys who were overseen by English officers and whose command and management fell entirely into the hands of the British. Given the timing of both the dismantlement of the Gwalior Army and Macy's deployment in central India, on the wake of the British subjugation of Gwalior, it's ultimately not surprising that his role was much in the service of military surveillance as much as it was in the service of archaeological explanation. So this, of course, does not answer the question of why the British became so invested in 1843, 1844, in suddenly controlling the regions of Gwalior state, and in effect, through them, also areas of Bundelkhand and Malwa. And the answer, the reason why seems to be quite obvious once you start thinking in terms of the globalizing market, in this case for narcotics. So it's no small coincidence, as Amr Faruqi has noted, that that just a year before the Gwalior campaign, the British won a decisive victory in the First Opium War against Qing Dynasty China that concluded with the Treaty of Nanjing, which gave British merchants expanded rights to trade opium at treaty ports and more control over tariffs. As it happens, Gwalior controlled the region of Malwa, which had been since the turn, or at least controlled the routes into Malwa, which had been since the turn of the 18th century by far the larger producer of opium for the foreign export market. While the opium fields in Bengal had long fallen under British control, and the British were able to exert a monopoly over it, Malwa opium was not only produced in areas partly controlled by the Gwalior princely state, but also, as Claude Markowitz has noted, more desirable within the Chinese market. It was also exceedingly hard to regulate. It was easily smuggled through routes that the British did not directly control. So there's been a fair amount written on the various tactics that the British employed to try to gain a monopoly over the opium trade in India, and I don't have time to rehearse them all here, but we'll rather direct anyone who's interested to the work of Claude Markowitz, Amr Faruqi, and more recently Rolf Bauer and Devyani Gupta, who has been working on the smuggling of opium through colonial era postal networks. What I will note in brief is that while the British were able to establish a monopoly over opium in Bengal prior to the British victory, while they had long been able to establish that monopoly in Bengal, prior to the British victory in the Third Anglo-Maratha War in 1818, they had very little control over production Malwa. And because Malwa opium was both stronger and cheaper than the opium produced in Bengal, it quickly then dominated the Chinese market. So by exploiting the British inability to control both the production and circulation of Malwa opium, native entrepreneurs in Malwa were thus able to carve out profitable new niches in the market. So as early as 1803, British officers began to express concern about the loss of revenue and to try to develop strategies to limit the ability of cultivators and traders to produce and sell Malwa opium. And even after they were able to gain territorial control over parts of Malwa after the Anglo-Maratha War in 1818, they were still not able to adequately regulate the routes and borders. And as a result, Mal was frequently able to outpace Bengal in the larger globalizing market. And you can see from these charts that the quantity of opium imported from Malwa far outpaced imports from the British-controlled fields and factories in Bengal. So they tried another strategy. In 1830, they started imposing a transit duty levied at the port of Bombay that was set low enough that it was more profitable to simply pay it than to attempt to get it out through more distant ports to the northwest through Sindh. And that helped to some degree. But the British were still losing out on profits since they were unable to establish a full monopoly on opium produced in Malwa. And the key obstacle to this was in fact Gwalior. That opium remained a crucial source of revenue for the Scindia rulers. So they were reluctant to give the East India Company exclusive rights to opium produced within their domains. And this was seen increasingly as a problem after the Third Anglo-Maratha War concluded in 1818, since it was in the decades that followed that the trade in opium began to really increase significantly. And of course, then the victory in Nanjing can be seen as an even more critical turning point for the British East India Company, since it was at that moment that they really secured the market in China, making it all the more imperative to shore up control over the flow of opium in the Indian subcontinent in order to maximize their profits. So then it seems to be no coincidence, as others have pointed out, that shortly following the victory in Nanjing, the First Opium War, the British undertook not one, but two military campaigns. One was the campaign against Gwalior, which I had mentioned in 1843, which gave them unprecedented control over Malwa. And the second was towards Sindh in the northwest, which was successfully annexed by the British also that same year. So needless to say, these two seemingly disconnected events produced a cohesive and extremely successful outcome. With the annexation of Sindh and the dismantlement of the Gwalior Army, the British were able to expand control over the major routes, establish a monopoly over Malwa opium, and take unprecedented control over both the means of opium production and the routes of narcotic transport at the very moment at which the market was growing exponentially. So what I'm effectively trying to suggest is that the first official deployment of officers specifically for the purposes of taking stock of India's archaeological past in the late 1840s was inextricably entangled with these British efforts to secure a monopoly over the global opium market. And this brings me to the second part of my presentation, second main part of it, which looks at Macy's actual activities and the fine line between surveying and surveillance. So British sources never really make it explicit that Macy's job was to survey a newly incorporated landscape, one that remained technically in possession of the Scindia rulers, but over which the British could exert greater control following the dismantlement of the Gwalior Army and the creation of the Gwalior contingent. Instead, they suggest that his primary duty was to survey antiquities and take stock of the archaeological landscape. In theory, this began already in 1845 with his original dispatch to Central India, during which his primary duty, this is prior to the official sort of dispatch in 1847, but during which his primary duty was to travel to Bundelkhand and report on monuments and antiquities surrounding an old fortress at Kalonjar, built around the turn of the first millennium by the prominent Chandela dynasty. He published the findings in great detail in a lengthy report in an 1848 issue of the Journal of the Asiatic Society of Bengal. The report is richly illustrated with drawings of monuments and sculptural details, all of which are described at great length in his text. Over the course of this work, he also surveyed the now famous temple site of Khajuraho, seen here in this wonderful panorama, also attributed to the Chandela kings in the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries. Macy's text is also peppered with speculations about modes of worship and religious origins, frequently positing connections between Hinduism and other ancient world traditions. This is, of course, connected to the larger antiquarian impulse to link ancient India with European classical civilizations and to trace threads of influence that moved primarily from west to east. As we'll see later, Macy was particularly invested in establishing a hierarchical superiority of European and particularly Christian traditions over Indic ones. So for all intents and purposes, Macy's Colonial publication carries the weight and fulfills all of the expectations of an early archaeological survey and report detailing ancient remains and architectural fragments and speculating on the origins of particular systems of belief and visual representation. It is also worth noting that this mode of description suggests a degree of abandonment and dereliction of a site as belonging primarily to a distant past. However, Colonial was not merely an archaeological relic at the time. It was an active hilltop fortress, one that was already well known to the British and that had figured prominently in the Anglo-Maratha Wars. The watercolor that you see here was drawn by none other than Colin Mackenzie in 1814, just 2 years after the fort was taken by the British from the Bundela kings, who had controlled it since the 17th century. As such, it could serve as a potential bastion for the British, or less appealingly, as a site for launching attacks on the British were it to fall into the hands of native rebels. Accordingly, when examined closely, it becomes clear that Macy's text includes not only archaeological descriptions, but also close observations of the fortifications. He writes about the topography and terrain, the location and degree of access to various sources of potable water, and also the physical condition and tactical position of a number of iron guns and artillery. In a particularly telling example, he notes the status of the first gate, located about 200 feet above the base of the hill, as being, quote, so far undefended. It seems to me that he's basically scoping out the grounds through a lens that was as much tactical as archaeological. And after all, we need to remember that his qualifications, he arrives here very shortly after graduating, just 2 years after graduating from Addiscombe Military Seminary, where he was trained not in archaeology, but in engineering and military survey. Macy's subsequent redeployment in 1847 to 48 under the aegis of establishing a more systematic approach to archaeological survey took him primarily to sites further west and to the territories belonging to the princely state of Gwalior. And although sources do not make it explicit, Macy was also likely housed at Chanderi, the site of this self-portrait, which was both a historically thriving mercantile center, long associated with textile production, but also home to a massive fortress, which, as we've seen before, has served for centuries as the major regional capital. In the 17th century, so after the Mughals, it fell into the hands of the Bundela kings of Bundelkhand, whose capital was located at Orcha, near Jhansi, and they held it until 1811, when it was captured by Dala Rao Scindia, then king of Gwalior. However, in 1844, with the dismantlement of the Gwalior Army, the Scindias ceded Chanderi to the British for the housing and maintenance of the armed forces of the newly formed Gwalior contingent. So I'm not have time to detail all of the places that Macy visited, but I want to point to a handful that make it clear that his archaeological imperative was likely secondary, even after this official commission, to the unspoken yet underlying goal of accumulating data crucial for military surveillance and strategic planning. So what is noticeable particularly, and we have in other documents that make it clear that His job really was to investigate sites along the main rivers, and particularly along the stretch of the Betwa that marked the boundary between the regions of Bundelkhand and Gwalior state, and other areas that marked routes into Malwa. So what is notable is how closely his sites corresponded to places that had played a crucial role in older routes of military campaigns. So I'm showing you here a map of early Sultanate conquests, campaigns to take Gwalior, Narwar, and Chanderi, but also the approximate routes traveled by the armies of the Chandela rulers of Jeja Kabuti, now Bundelkhand, from the fortresses at Ajayagar and Kalanjar. And so Macy was basically traversing a lot of the same ground. And just to give you a sense, so here you can see that he's navigating the same ground also as travelers like Ibn Battuta in the 1340s, but also the Mughal Emperor Babur, whose passage I've mapped here on the right. And you'll notice that there's a particularly strong correspondence between the places that Macy surveyed and the sites that feature prominently for Babur in his conquest of Chanderi. So when we look at Babur's route, it follows the various paths of rivers and tributaries. Most of these do, either along the Sindh or along the Betwa. And in the case of Babur, in his push towards Chanderi, he makes two crucial last stops. One is at a place called Bandar, and the other at a place called Kadwaha, both of which I will talk about briefly in turn, both of which were visited also by Macy. So Bandar here you can see is located along the course of a river known as the Pahuj Nadi. So Macy stops at both of these places. And to start with Bandar, so what makes Macy stop at Bandar particularly curious is the fact that there's very little of archaeological interest. He describes the site as possessing few or no remains of any antiquity, but he takes the time nonetheless to produce a highly detailed and carefully measured drawing of a water tank that he describes as being quite modern. He also visits the neighboring village of Ramgarh, where he makes a very quick sketch of an actual historic monument, an overview of a small pillared chhatri or open air pavilion. And I might posit therefore that his investment in Bandar was less in his status as an archaeological site than its strategic location at a crossing point in this river, in the Puj Nadi, where one could find ample sources of water, a tank for use by soldiers, and a river to supply an army of horses. So surveying water sources and crossing points. At Kadwaha, Macy produced 6 drawings, which focus primarily on a large temple situated on the eastern edge of the village. The temple today is known as the Tauteshwara Mahadeva. We have 5 drawings that Macy made of this temple, including several details of pillars, a ground plan, and this elegantly rendered elevation. This is a site that I've spent actually a lot of time surveying in the field. I've written quite a bit about it, and his drawings are extremely accurate. You can see the comparison here. And unlike Bandar, Kadwaha is arguably a major archaeological site. Although not extremely well known outside of specialists in the field, it possesses the remains of no fewer than 15 temples dating between the 9th and 11th centuries, all of which fall just beyond the boundaries of the walls that once enclosed the village. And you can get a sense for the distribution from the map on the lower right. Given this wealth of material, it's curious that Macy did not spend more time exploring the remains of Kadwaha's other temples. It's true that the Tauteshwara Mahadeva is by far the most impressive, but I suspect that his real interest was in the fact that the Tauteshwara Mahadeva once stood along the banks of a large artificial lake that extended around the town. And although this lake doesn't really exist today, you can get a sense for the contours from one of my reconstruction maps. And this is a large lake that also led the Mughal Emperor Babur to set up camp at Kadwaha, as it provided for him an ample source of water for his troops and his elephants and horses. So although Kadwaha was not recorded as a site of military occupation in British colonial records, there is evidence on the ground to suggest that it either served as a significant outpost in the, that it served as a significant outpost in the 18th and 19th centuries. And the clearest evidence for this can be found through the presence among the village's winding streets of a small, as of yet unpublished chhatri, featuring images of Indian sepoys wearing military uniforms and carrying guns with bayonets. And you can see here a frieze procession that includes also camels and an elephant. And on another side, we see details of swordplay, dancing, and a pair of horse-drawn carriages. And above, a fairly typical notch scene depicting a seated general or ruler accompanied by soldiers watching music and a dance performer. To make that scene more legible, I include a cutout of the main figures here. So in looking for comparisons for these figures, the closest I could find was from an exhibition catalog centered on the French mercenary Renaud de Boigny, who was entrusted with building and training an army for the Maharaja of Gwalior in the late 18th century. And he incidentally oversaw a campaign into Bundelkhand that resulted in the capture of the fort in Colonial in 1783. And you can see comparable images with muskets and bayonets, horse-drawn chariots, in this case here hauling a cannon. While I cannot precisely date this chhatri, at least not yet, it's clear that Kadwaha was the site of military significance in ongoing negotiations of regional power between Gwalior state and Bundelkhand during the late 18th and 19th centuries. That's probably one of the reasons why Macy made it there. So if we continue looking at the geography of Macy's travels, we find other correspondences with places that would have been important to survey primarily for tactical advantages, for their ability to enable the British to best surveil the routes and junctures, enabling passages through the rural stretches of Gwalior state. One of Macy's earlier assignments in the area, for example, seems to have been the recording of antiquities at a place called Renaud. Although Renaud is not well known today, it was in earlier periods a crucial political and administrative stronghold. As I've indicated elsewhere, its history begins before the turn of the first millennium, when it emerged as an ascetic retreat for a then burgeoning group of Shaiva ascetics known as the Matamayoras. And that's my interest in Renaud really started with my first book on monasteries. By the 14th and 15th centuries, it had grown to include a sizable Muslim population, witnessed through a number of mosques and tombs built during the reigns of the Sultans Sher Khan of Chanderi and Mahmud Shah of Malwa. By the middle of the 17th century, it was granted as a tahsil by the Mughal Emperor Jahangir to an individual named Chaudhry Chintaman Bhagpal, whose family continued to hold the deed for at least the next 250 years. In the late 17th century, it was a Mughal military garrison under the control of Sher Afghan Khan, who served as one of the many buffers against the advances of the Bundela kings, who were aligned with the Marathas, and so forth. So, the bottom line is that it served as a useful bastion as a fully walled city with massive defensible gates. So, and we know that Renaud continued to be important well through the 19th century. It served as a crucial site for a battle in December 1858 between Robert Napier and Firoz Shah, during which Napier was able to rout the rebels at Renaud and significantly strengthen the British by taking it under control during the what is often called the Mutiny or the First War of Independence. So not much is really known about Macy's war. The other point about Renaud, it falls at the bottom of the Hyderabad River at a crucial juncture. So if you're traveling along the Betwa and you want to transition to the Sindh, this is the crucial place where one could cross and then follow the rivers northward. So that's what I think the strategic significance of Renaud is. And we don't know very much about Macy's work at Renaud. All we really have is a set of drawings, both dated to 1847, which represent different versions of the same large slab depicting two intertwined nagas that stood at the banks of the Hyderabad River. So clearly he was interested because of its position at the Hyderabad River. What seems to be revealing is its location at a spot, which according to Macy's notes, stood about 100 yards southwest of the river near the gateway leading to the fortified citadel. So again, looking at fortified areas along these river routes. And indeed, if we move up the river, we find a series of key fortified bastions, a number of which served again as sites of Macy's explorations. Just to give you a few examples, we go northward, we arrive at Sonagiri, a place that Macy calls Sonawal, but which is in fact the same site, now in the Datia district of Madhya Pradesh. And there we find Macy creating a handful of drawings of the site's famous Jain temples, which of course is in keeping for the expectations of archaeological survey, unless we also consider the fact that the temples were situated on a sizable hilltop from which it would be easy to surveil the outlying landscape. If we continue going northward, up the Sindh River, we get to Ratnagar and Sionda, both of which were also surveyed by Macy. So although Ratnagar is detailed only through a small illustration of a goddess temple, ensconced in the corner of a larger plate with drawings of details from other sites, he notes its topographic significance, situated at the high point of one of the main ridges of hills and within walled compounds with ornamented battlements. Sionda, however, was deemed worthy of more extensive treatment. And I find this not surprising, given that it was home to a massive fortress overlooking a key crossing point over the mighty Sindh River. From Sionda, we get a dramatic watercolor drawing of the gateway to the old fortress, following the picturesque tradition. But we also get a detailed view of the old bridge, allowing liberal passage just beyond the cascading waterfalls, for which the site remains famous still today. It's worth noting that the gateway is depicted not as an ancient ruin, overgrown beyond recognition, but as a formidable edifice capable of being repurposed for use. So Macy's drawing of the bridge and falls follow particularly well within the tradition of military surveying, such as seen in a series of watercolor drawings of the regional fortress of Narwar, rendered by soldier artists for the East India Company at the onset of the Third Anglo-Maratha War in 1818. What is worth noting is the investment not merely in the fortified landscape, but in the infrastructure, in the surveilling and recording details of the bridges enabling the passage of the army across the nearby Sindh River. Macy's travels were not confined fully to areas between the Betwa and Sindh. He also moved northwestward into Rajasthan and the Punjab. So for example, in 1847, he made a couple of drawings of a cave up on the hills near Dholpur, the site of a massive fortress at a key crossing point along the northern banks of the Chambal River. Incidentally, Dholpur was not far from the village of Maharajpur, just across the Chambal River to the east, which was the location of the final defeat of the Gwalior Army just a few years earlier on December 29, 1843. He also produced a few drawings of a modern water tank at a place called Amau, which he describes as being between Salaya and Alampur in Rajasthan. Although I've not been able to quite locate the site, I have a strong suspicion that it might have been somewhere in the vicinity of the nearby fort at Bansur, just 10 kilometers away from Alampur in Rajasthan. So with this movement across the Chambal and into Rajasthan, Macy's surveys start looking suspiciously like more than just an archaeological survey or even a surreptitious attempt at surveillance within the boundaries of Gwalior state. His movements begin to resemble the paths and routes most often used for smuggling opium to the northwest, across the Chambal River into Mewar and onward to the northwest. So with that, I move to my last section, my end conclusion. I'll try to do that relatively quickly. So Macy's meanderings in Gwalior state ended abruptly in 1852, as I mentioned, when he was called away to serve as a surveyor in the Second Anglo-Burmese War. And that was also the end of his career in archaeological explorations. He continued to work in India for many decades, but in other capacities. But that does not mean that his interest in India's archaeological history had disappeared. It continued as a side hobby, possibly even a passion, and is manifested most clearly in the production of his own monograph on Sanchi, published posthumously in 1892. So I should be clear that this is a publication that has not had a tremendous influence, and in fact, for a good reason. Macy himself was not a scholar, and his work on Sanchi is not particularly useful for its historical insight. Instead, his primary contribution was to reiterate a number of long-held and rather implausible views of both the site's original attribution and the antiquity of Buddhism. In his opinion, the site at Sanchi represented a pre-Buddhist form of worship dedicated to sun, fire, and elemental worship, and Buddhism itself, in his mind, could not be dated much earlier than the onset of the Christian era. As Tapati Guha Dekorte again has pointed out elsewhere, Macy's views on Sanchi were grounded less in historical reality than in what Cunningham described as, quote, the pious wish to prove that Christianity was older than Buddhism. Thus, his main contribution was less through his own historical findings than in the illustrations that continued to circulate in the service of other other archaeological writings. And so one of his goals throughout his writings, as we see also in his report in Kalinjar many decades earlier, was to prove that the key architectural forms and imagery found at Sanchi were not only analogous, but also of the same origin and significance as certain figures, emblems found even earlier in places like Assyria, Persia, and Greece. Of course, by the late 19th century, this was not unusual. It was part of a larger imperial intellectual project of imagining the Indian nation and situating its past in a hierarchical relationship that better reflected the present imperial aspirations of British colonial officials than historical realities as articulated on the ground. Macy's earlier explorations, however, came at a moment prior to the imagining of an Indian nation state, during which the driving force underlying archaeological exploration was less the recovery of an Indian past than a desire for military control over Gwalior state and the geography and routes of travel that were crucial for colonial profits. If we consider the larger map of Macy's travels, it becomes pretty clear that his main investments were in sites that ran along, again, the Betwa and the Sindh River. These were places that were frequently of archaeological significance because of their close connection to older historic routes of travel extending the entire distance between Gwalior and Vidisha. And this is exactly sort of the routes of travel that one would take in order to make it from Kanauj, Delhi, and elsewhere all the way through to Vidisha. From this lower leg of his explorations down closer to Vidisha, we get a rich body of illustrations. The famous pillar at Iran, the sculptural details and reliquaries of sites such as Gyarispur and Sonagiri. And this eventually led down to Sanchi, which should raise the question also of the timing of the excavations undertaken there. If Macy's deployment and British interest in central India were increasingly connected to the British interest in opium after the Treaty of Nanjing, then can we also begin to connect it and this moment of archaeological exploration to a growing investment also in opium futures and opium profits? Is what we're seeing a fundamental entanglement of the institution of Indian archaeology and a pivotal moment in the history of the rediscovery of Buddhism at its very origin, and at least in central India, with apparatuses for amassing military intelligence and controlling routes of travel that were specifically tied to the expansion of British commerce and opium more specifically. And certainly many of Macy's drawings found their way into Cunningham's publication of British topes, along with topographic studies and close studies of key architecture and sculptural features. And many contain long paragraphs of text interweaving prose descriptions and including precise measurements. And some of these drawings also interwove Macy's own predilection for exploring connections between ancient British and ancient Indian architecture and religion. So we see here, for example, this comparison between Druid and Buddhist monuments seems to be more Macy than Cunningham. So there are many other kind of legacies that we can draw out. So Macy himself, while he himself was not particularly prolific after his departure from central India, his drawings of Sanchi and its vicinity had a long-lasting influence. We find them being reused frequently for both study and publication for many decades in publications such as James Ferguson's Tree and Serpent Worship, which essentially was shaped, widely read and referenced, and shaped understandings of ancient Indian art and religion for many subsequent generations. And you can see how many of Macy's drawings were reused in these various publications. So the second legacy, and I will cut this very short, is environmental. And so the push to increase opium production in Malwa in the 19th century had significant effects on the landscape. We know that opium, of course, was already a commodity during the Mughal era, but its areas of production were relatively limited in scope. We know from the work of economic historians that the number of chests of opium passing through the market increased significantly over the course of the 19th century, showing a radical increase through the 1870s with a sizable, and we also know that the areas under cultivation grew substantially through the early 20th century. So opium continues, of course, to be cultivated in Malwa today, both legally and illegally, albeit at a far lesser volumes. And the region has become instead a major producer of other agricultural use. But this kind of initial agricultural impetus has had long-term vast environmental effects. And so throughout my larger project, in brief, I've been looking for ways to sort of historicize the landscape of central India, to better envision the ways in which architecture and landscape serve to mediate human relationships with nature. And because of the globalization of agricultural industries, the colonial period marked a significant turn in the environmental transformation of Madhya Pradesh, as forests were felled and rivers were diverted to make way for increasing agrarian production. And we all know these are some of the effects of this. Even more recently, the last 15 to 20 years has seen an unprecedented sort of move towards agricultural expansion through the digging of new canals, the felling of forests for farmland, and the construction of new dams. And we know that Madhya Pradesh has experienced a rate of agricultural growth nearly triple the national average over the last 20 years alone. And so I've seen this effects of these in the field firsthand. And so these are a few photographs from a trip I took to Gwalior in 2018, where you can see the transformation of the landscape around Narwar, which was much more wooded just 15 or 20 years back. I'm going to skip that. I'll move to that. But perhaps the most tragic loss has been that of natural habitats. You can get a good sense of this from Irfan Habib's Atlas of the Mughal Empire, which draws particular attention to the dense forests that had historically served as a hunting ground for wild elephants. In this case, in Malwa, this was also true further east around Narwar and throughout Bundelkhand. The ubiquity of elephants is amply illustrated in Mughal painting. In this folio here from the Babarnama, we see a herd of elephants. We see the Mughal Emperor Akbar inspecting a newly captured elephant. We see him depicted on horseback, facing the beast, who's tethered to a tree just north of the painting center. And we know that this is so this whole area, Malwa, Gwalior State, was really favorite grounds for elephant capture. And we can see from Irfan Habib's map, sort of this whole area of cultivations, all forested areas of elephant habitat. But this, of course, stands in contrast with the landscape today, where the elephant that once ran wild in central India is officially listed as endangered. Their population reduced by at least half over the last 75 years. And the largest threat to their existence is deforestation. So elephants require large, vast tracts of trees on which to graze and roam, and they wind up spend about 80% of their time eating, consuming approximately 330 to 375 pounds of vegetation daily. So, and exacerbating the situation is the simple fact that the current nature preserves set aside for the elephants are not large enough to sustain them, forcing them to wander beyond their confines in search of food. And this has led to increasing conflicts with humans, as seen in the continual kind of wanderings of wild elephants into populated areas. And so one of the things I'm exploring is whether or not, or the extent to which, the kind of agrarian expansions enabled by, in the 19th century, enabled by the kind of regulation of the land through this kind of military surveillance, looking at the relationship that had in transforming in setting up the conditions for continued agrarian development, and setting up the situation where we are looking at this kind of environmental threat to human subsistence, and also to endangered species that continues to persist today. And I'm going to end right here because I think that this is about time. So this is sort of the trajectory of the long array project, sort of starting around 650, looking at the development of settlements in the landscape, and then thinking about the transformations that have been manifest over the last 200 years.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tamara, for giving us such an extensive talk on the Central Indian region for the colonial era and relating roots which we could trace. And now I welcome our professors to please come forward and comment or make suggestions about the talk, please. Razi sir, Seema ma'am, Parul ma'am.
Okay. Yeah.
Razi, Seema?
Yeah. Oh, so I see Parul's question here. Yes, I need to go back to London, actually. So last time I was in London, this is in about 2-3, it was about a year before the pandemic. I've gone through Macy's drawings many times both in the archives as well as on the online sources. He also has a handwritten diary, which I started going through, and I was able to read through it quickly last time I was there. But there may be additional material in there that I need to, because since I was there, I've done more work on this. I need to go back and reread it through a new lens, because again, this sort of opium connection was not something I had really thought about when I was first reading it. So I need to go back and mine it, because he also details places that he went that are not necessarily represented always through his drawings. And I have lists that I from my notes that I took while I was there, but I need to go back and I think look at it. I need about a weekend or so to go back and look at it through a new lens. So that's one set of sources. There may be also local sources, but they're very hard to access. So then there are other materials as well in the field that I was not able to cover here. So I spent a lot of time just walking, traveling the routes, the old roads, as much as I could. And there's a lot of just material that I have mapped in the field that I need to incorporate also into this. So evidence for fortresses with later temples that are not published, that clearly date to the 18th or 19th century, that need to be thought through and incorporated into this analysis. So
thank you. That's really fascinating, Tamara.
Yeah.
And I loved the way that you mapped the roots. And that's what kind of, the paintings that you showed and the roots that you matched and the correspondence between them. It's sort of just that little bit that would clinch it is, I guess, maybe somewhere in some archive, some clue of this, very studied agenda of military surveillance and strategic planning would, but the evidence that you throw up is absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much.
I mean, if anyone has suggestions about where to look for some of that material, because again, I'm not a historian of colonial India, and so I've been trying to find whatever I can. But also, there are also some inscriptional material and some more material at Narwar. But again, this is something that I've been sort of poking at, and so if anyone has suggestions about where to look, I would be very happy to have those. Because you're right. I mean, it would be. This is something I've sort of pieced together, and it makes sense. I mean, his drawings don't make sense unless you think about them in relationship to routes of travel.
Yes, you've thrown up so much evidence through all that,
But
it's a source in itself. And it doesn't, it's not necessary for it to be validated as such through
but it'd be
one
great.
Comment, but it would be great if it.
It would be really great.
Wouldn't the Narwar royal family have records? Because I was just talking to them and remnants of the family, and they seem to have a lot of things up their alley. And also, I think, I was looking at some local documentation. I think it should be there. I just went to Paragarh recently, so at Paragarh also. What have you noticed at Paragarh? I noticed that there is a change in sectarian affiliation of temples. Which is very, very evident, and that happens quite late. From the 19th century. It's during the colonial period that this kind of, when there is a weakening of certain control over these forts that is happening due to colonial intervention, that is when you have this kind of change in sectarian identities of particular temples. Have you noticed any more? Because
absolutely. Absolutely. Mostly to Shaiva, actually. There's a lot of formerly Vaishnava temples that are now have lingas in them. And it's hard to date precisely when that happened but I see that all the time in the field. It's really that sort of that shift mostly to Shaiva is what I've seen. And of course there's this growth of new sect, there's this growth of the of this Bijas and Devi tradition, which seems to really kind of grow in the 18th and 19th century, especially. So there also seems to be other kinds of ritual and religious networks, which again, I haven't been able to I've done some mapping of that, but haven't been, I think that's, there's another huge project in there actually for anyone who wants to, and I think that we do need to do more on the kind of colonial era history of these areas, because they tend to get looked at. I went there looking at from the perspective of somebody interested in the 10th and 11th and 12th century. I went there to see the earlier temples, and I just started recording everything I found in the field, because it just was, I felt like I couldn't understand what was going on in the 10th and 11th century unless I also understood what was happening afterwards. But I feel like there's a huge project there that needs to be done. And there are a couple of, I know there are a couple of graduate students who are working in that area. There's a PhD student who's starting a project in Gwalior, working with Nachiket Chantani at Michigan. And there's another one at NYU who's working in that area.
How do you think that, the railway, the coming of the railway changes the
it absolutely does,
and other landscapes of this area? Because suddenly Renaud, for example, was was the district headquarters, and changed to Shivpuri. So there is an entire denudation of particular urban sites and the religious networks that they supported when the railway comes in.
No, that's absolutely right. Now I have a it wasn't on this material, but in thinking about sort of the long history of the routes, I've given a couple of talks where I throw in the railway map as well, because I think that's basically what changes and shifts and makes this area even more remote than it. I don't think it ever was a huge hub. I think there were just these centers like Shivpuri or Isagar or that were hubs and postal centers, but there was a lot of area in between. But I think it's become even more remote. Like, we've lost that kind of contextual history because of the railroads. The railroads completely changed the way people experience those spaces and move around them. So it's absolutely, the history of the railroad is and it's a relatively recent reconfiguration, going back only about 100, 150, 120 years or so. But the other thing that I think is something that I think shapes, and the present day perception, are the quality of the roads, which are terrible. So I think that, and the shape of the roads are also different. So one of the things I tried to do at one point in the field was drive the old Kadwaha Chanderi road, and they were sort of reworking it at the time, and at a certain point had to turn back because it just was no longer drivable. But that was the
pretty good now. I just went about a month back.
Is it good? The Kadwaha Chandler?
Pretty good. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
very good.
They were in the process of repaving it. This was
fantastic.
Yeah,
This is a good road.
Yeah, this is a while back. It's about 10 years ago, so it was a while back. But yeah, so you just drove that road and it's totally easy. That's fantastic. That's great to know.
And
then there's places like Tuban, which, you know, again, have you been to Tuban?
I've been to Tuban.
Yeah,
it's 3 or 4 times. Yeah, but the road is not bad now, except that it's Kacha road, but it's still very navigable.
Yeah,
it's a good road. I just went in this trip only. So Tuban and
yeah, it's an incredible site.
It's an incredible site. Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't want to monopolize this. So there are some other questions, I think, in the chat box.
Yes,
no, thank you for your insight. Yeah. Okay.
Yes, ma'am. There's a question by Shiva Aruni from Facebook. How do you consider the archaeological studies of the Bombay Presidency with the Central Indian region by the British East India Company during pre-1858 period? Specifically, the architectural documentation at Ahmedabad, Bijapur, Chalukyan temple sites, and epigraphical surveys, etc., conducted by the British officers from the Bombay Presidency.
Oh boy, that's a very good question. I haven't actually looked extensively at them, at least not in a long time. I would say you'd have to ask somebody like, no, you would have to ask somebody who's been working more extensively in the Deccan, like Pushkar Sahoni or, you know.
Okay,
so
we have
no, I mean, I wouldn't be able to answer that at this stage right now. I'd have to go take a look.
Okay, ma'am. We have another question by Rajshri Avasti. Are there any artifacts or evidences found which would be of interest to archaeologists, anthropologists, ascertaining the social or cultural view of the time?
I mean, it depends on certainly a lot of inscriptions, memorial pillars, sati stones. You know, I found abandoned fortresses. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of material out in the field that would be of interest, I think. I think what's, you know, Professor Bawa just mentioned, the, you know, the kind of shifting of sectarian affiliations of temples is absolutely fascinating. And I certainly think that, you know, I think somebody should go out there and survey the Bijasen Devi temples and things like that, which, because there are all these networks that are developing during that time, which I think would be worth taking a closer look at.
Also, a lot of prehistoric cave painting sites, at least 20.
Yep, there's a ton of those. No, there's a lot of material, so it really depends on what period you're interested in. I also think that something that may, you know, that we don't always do, but is worth doing, is looking also at some of the archaeological reports in the 19th century for some of the, you know, ethnographic descriptions, because there's, you know, there are all these stories and legends and they change over time. But I've also found that talking to people in the field, you learn a tremendous amount as well. Just it's, you know, I would never ever discount anything that anyone has to say in the field, because there's just a lot of accumulated memory. Also, you know, among families, some of whom have been in those areas for a very long time. So, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's certainly, yeah.
I would like to invite any of the participants who want to ask question in this Zoom meeting, please come forward. And if there's any question. Okay, so as we don't have any more questions, on behalf of the seminar committee, the Department of History, University of Delhi, I would like to thank you, Dr. Tamara, for being with us here today and giving us such an amazing talk on this topic. Thank you so much, ma'am. And also, I would like to announce our next talk. It will be on the 20th April, Wednesday, by Dr. Stephen M. Bose. And the topic will be locating Jain Tantra in late medieval Indian social and political life. I request everyone to please be on here with us on 20th as well. We will be looking forward to see you all. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you so much.